This fort stands on what was the most threatened of all the frontiers of the British Empire. At Kingston in Canada, the Fort Henry Guard still pay homage to the imperial past, and do so with pride in the uniforms and the drill of the 1860s. For 100 years, the British Army defended this frontier and stood in arms against the nation to the south, a former colony, the United States. Indeed, the Duke of Wellington described Canada as all frontier and nothing else. The struggle to control North America began in Europe, where Britain and France were ancient rivals. In the 17th century, each nation acquired part of the new continent. The British settled along the Atlantic seaboard, New England and Nova Scotia, and built trading posts round Hudson Bay. The French colonized the banks of a great river which led deep into the interior, the St. Lawrence. They called their colony New France. To command the approaches to the St. Lawrence, on the wild and desolate coast of Cape Breton, the French built a great fortress, Louisbourg, named for their king, Louis XV. It was based on the plans of the greatest military architect of the time, Vauban. It cost £1 million. King Louis once said that he expected to wake in Versailles and see the walls of Louisbourg rising over the western horizon. Louisbourg had a garrison of 3,000 men, armed with over 500 pieces of artillery. In 1758, Britain and France were again at war, and there was fighting across the world from India to the St. Lawrence. A British force was sent to take Louisbourg. They set up siege guns and bombarded it into surrender. The walls, cracked by freezing Atlantic fogs, crumbled easily. James Wolfe was a brigadier of the regular army who distinguished himself at the siege. He was 32 years old, a neurotic, sickly, and indecisive man. He longed for fame. In 1759, he was given command of an expedition that was to sail 800 miles up the St. Lawrence and take the capital of New France, Quebec. In May, 200 ships sailed up the treacherous river using charts made by a promising young navigator, Captain Cook. The French were astounded when this huge fleet arrived below Quebec. The British had control of the river, but the city was thought impregnable, not so much for its walls, but for the cliffs on which it stood. Any attack would have to be made within 5 months before the river froze into an icy trap. The French commander, Montcalm, safe behind his defences, waited for the British to give up and go away. Wolfe, in his farmhouse headquarters, sat out the summer, making plan after plan, often in pain from rheumatism and the stone, and bickering with his officers. Meanwhile, the fleet bombarded Quebec day and night. Finally, Wolfe decided to move his army upriver past the city and, by cutting off French supplies, force Montcalm to come out and fight. Time was running out. He adopted a most hazardous plan. Early in the morning of September the 13th, an advance party landed a few miles above the city. Their orders were to climb the Heights of Abraham, as the cliffs were called at this point. They were to seize a French post at the top, guarding a track, up which the main British army could march. Surprise was essential. The cliff is only 170 feet high, but its surface was slippery after heavy rain. Here was born the legend of a whole army dragging itself up a precipice by the stumps of trees. In fact, it took the advance party just 10 minutes to reach the top and overrun the French post. The way was then clear for the main army to march up the track and deploy in line of battle on the plain. Each side fielded about 4,000 men, but all the British were regulars. Their strongest contingent was the Fraser Highlanders. They prepared to fight a typically stylized 18th century battle. It took 37 precise movements to prepare their Brown Bess muskets for firing. Montcalm advanced too soon, without waiting for half his force to reach the battlefield. Such battles were a test of nerve, as well as of skill. Too far away to be effective, the French fired.
One pace to the rear as you stand! March!
Wolfe had trained his men to hold their fire until the enemy were at 30 paces.
78th, Fraser Highlanders! Present!
The British fired at 25 paces.
Fire!
The French crumbled, and Montcalm was mortally wounded. The battle that secured North America for the British was all over in 15 minutes. Wolfe was also killed on the field of battle. He had achieved the death and the fame he desired. 4 days later, Quebec surrendered, and the British took over a city in ruins after 2 months' bombardment by the fleet. It seemed a hollow conquest. When the time came to sign a peace treaty, the British argued among themselves whether to keep Canada or Guadeloupe, a West Indian island rich in sugar, which they'd also captured from France. In the end, they decided to keep Canada, with its 60,000 French inhabitants and 1 million square miles of wilderness. The French had come to this wilderness to trade in furs with the Indians, in competition with the Hudson's Bay Company. They used the Indian birch bark canoe to carry trade goods, guns, axes, and brandy. The canoe men were known as voyageurs. They could paddle for 18 hours a day, traveling 3,000 miles in a season. And as they paddled, they sang. They were brave, brawling, proud men, the true explorers of the interior of North America, west to the Rockies, south to the Gulf of Mexico. With the traders went missionaries, mostly Jesuits. Some were put to death by the Indian tribes who had been enlisted in the colonial struggle between British and French. They endured the customary tortures in a way that impressed even their Indian executioners. Nuns of the Ursuline order came to Quebec in the 1640s. Their leader was Mother Marie de l'Incarnation, who came from France to start a school for Indian children. Her school grew into one of the most famous convents in the world. The Ursulines brought with them some of the graces of France. Their convent in Quebec had been bombarded by the British, but immediately after the conquest, the nuns were knitting stockings for Highland soldiers. The Roman Catholic Church was the chief influence in shaping New France, but its rule was gentler than that of the Puritan colonists down in New England. After the British conquest, French Canadians looked to the church for political as well as spiritual leadership. One of Canada's founding fathers was Bishop Laval, an imperious man who established a seminary in Quebec for the training of native priests. After the conquest, the royal officials of France went home, but from Quebec, a network of pastoral care spread over the province. Here, the voice of the priest was the only acceptable authority, and, of course, it spoke in French.
Le Seigneur nous accueille, nous, pauvres que nous sommes, et il nous invite à accueillir le pauvre et aussi à nous accueillir les uns les autres. Faisons donc confiance à Dieu.
Most of the French were farmers, and after the conquest they clung to their land more closely than ever. The farms were laid out in strips running down to the St. Lawrence, the essential highway. The family of Fortunat de Montigny has owned this farm since the 1650s. French Canadians say of themselves, the past is our master. They had always been self-sufficient during the 7 long months of winter each year, when they were cut off from France. Now they turned in upon themselves even more. After the conquest, French Canadians achieved the highest birth rate ever recorded among people of European stock, as if nature and the long nights had come to their aid. The Catholic French still felt outnumbered and threatened by their old enemies to the south, the Puritan New Englanders. When Britain gave French Canada religious toleration and its own language and laws under the Quebec Act, the Puritans saw this as a popish conspiracy prompted by the devil himself. In Boston, they feared the triumph of the Pope in their Protestant streets. The old American colonies already had grievances, notably the tax on tea imposed by Britain. In 1775, their resentment exploded into rebellion. rebel colonies there was a general call to arms against the crown. The rebel colonists forgot their religious prejudice and formally invited the French Canadians to send delegates to the Continental Congress at Philadelphia. The Catholic French remained loyal to a Protestant but tolerant king and refused. The first military act of the Revolutionary Congress was to invade Canada. The rebels attacked Quebec in 1776 and were defeated. Their general, Montgomery, was killed. George Washington became the chief hero of the American Revolution. His campaigns were painted by artists in heroic style. The world has come to accept the rebel view that he led a severely oppressed people and that their cause was a just one. In the rebel view, King George III was a lout, a bully, and a madman. But at that time he was not mad. In defending his territories against rebellion, he was doing what any king of the day regarded as a sacred duty. Probably 1/3 of the king's American subjects stayed loyal. About the same supported the rebellion, and another third remained neutral. About 50,000 loyalists enlisted to fight for the king. British regulars were contemptuous of the American irregulars, farmers and frontiersmen in outlandish garb. They called them Yankee Doodles. Derision turned sour when General Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. This was the end for the British. 7,000 officers and men marched out while the American bands played Yankee Doodle to rub in their triumph. When the war ended in 1783, the peace was a bitter one. The British and American delegates met in Paris. But when Benjamin West set about painting them, the British refused to sit. After the rebels' declaration of independence, loyalty to the British Crown became treason. Loyalists were deprived of their property, strung up in the name of liberty, even hanged. 200,000 fled. Most of the Anglican clergy left, including Charles Inglis, who in Nova Scotia became the first Anglican bishop in the empire. And there was Flora MacDonald, who 30 years before had smuggled Bonnie Prince Charlie away from the English and onto the Isle of Skye. From the newly formed territory of the United States, thousands of loyalist refugees streamed across the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, the new frontier, and settled in unoccupied bush country. Their settlements were formed later into a new province called Upper Canada, while Quebec province was renamed Lower Canada. Just across the river from the United States, the Loyalists built the capital of their new province, Niagara-on-the-Lake. The British government gave them generous grants of land, together with supplies for 3 years. Born and bred in colonial America, within 10 years they were building houses like these and recapturing the graces of the society from which they had been expelled. The Loyalists treasured their connection with the British Crown that went back to Raleigh and the Elizabethans. When they died, they were proud to put U-E-L after their names, United Empire Loyalist, the first time such a title was used. This was the house of another distinguished Loyalist, not far from Niagara, Captain Joseph Brant, otherwise known as Thayendanege, a Mohawk Indian chief. In the recent war, he had led his warriors against the rebel colonists. They had terrorized New York State, and their atrocities had given scope to rebel propaganda. But Brant was far from being just a scalp-hunting savage. He had been to London. He had met James Boswell and sat for fashionable painters. He'd been received at court by George III, who gave him a medal and an officer's silver gorget. He was a devout Anglican, and he translated the gospel into the Mohawk tongue. These are descendants of the warriors who followed Brant to Canada. This was the first Protestant church to be built in Upper Canada. It stands on the remnant of the large reserve at Brantford, given by George III to be theirs for as long as the sun shall shine and the waters flow. This church replaced their original one in the Mohawk Valley of New York State. George III gave it his coat of arms, and it resumed the proud designation of His Majesty's Chapel of the Mohawks. As a result of Brant's loyalty, his tribe was broken in two, because part of it remained in the United States. Mohawk Indians, French Canadians, and American loyalists, the founding peoples of British Canada, were still threatened by their enemies just across the water. Their settlements were protected by British Army forts like Fort George outside Niagara. Even when Britain was fighting Napoleon for survival in Europe, 6,000 regulars kept watch on the new frontier. Tension rose when Britain blockaded Napoleon's Europe and insisted on its right to search American ships on the high seas. In that same summer of 1812, when Napoleon led the Grand Army into Russia, war began between Britain and the United States. The Niagara frontier became a battlefield as 6,000 Americans marched against it. From Fort George, General Isaac Brock marched out to meet the American invaders as they crossed the Niagara River at Queenston. The British drove the Americans off the heights and back across the river. Like Wolfe, Brock was killed in the moment of victory. He became a hero of British Canada. They gave him a column at Queenston higher than Nelson's in London, and from the top he surveys the land he saved. The war meandered back and forth across the river for 2 more years. The Americans burned Niagara and Toronto. The British burned Washington and the White House. As always in Canada, operations on water were more important than those on land. Naval battles were fought on the Great Lakes, 1,000 miles inland from the sea. And on the Atlantic, there were ship-to-ship duels in which the British, 7 years after Trafalgar, were defeated again and again. This growing American power was grudgingly acknowledged by the Times. Despicable in the cabinet, ridiculous in the field, upon the waves, they retain the blood and spirit almost of Englishmen. But Canada remained British, a rare failure for the American eagle, which was swallowing up territory at a steady rate. It was a form of imperialism no less effective for being carried out in the name of a democratic republic rather than in the name of a king. In 1783, the original 13 colonies had quickly swallowed up all former British territories as far as the Mississippi. In 1803, they had bought most of the Middle West from Napoleon, the so-called Louisiana Purchase. In 1845, Texas was annexed from Spanish Mexico. In the 1840s, California was also taken by war from Mexico. And then Oregon was added, which had hitherto been claimed by Britain. All this in 75 years. It seemed inevitable that the scattered provinces of British North America should also fall prey to this hungry eagle. As obnoxious as their expansionism was the political system of the Yankees. British monarchists saw democracy as the fatal germ that produced the gangrene of republicanism. The Duke of Wellington said, "Wherever a democratical influence or even a democratical press exists, we must expect to find enemies." As Commander-in-Chief, he recommended the fortification of the Canadian frontier, which was the longest and the most vulnerable in the Empire. At vast expense, a chain of forts was built to guard the invasion routes into Canada, Quebec, Montreal, and Fort Henry here at Kingston. Wellington had recommended that 13,000 British regulars be stationed permanently on this frontier. These guns at Fort Henry had been brought across the Atlantic for the War of 1812. They were to remain in constant service for another 50 years.
Run out! Number 1 gun, fire! Number 2 gun, fire! Number 3 gun, fire!
The garrison officers helped preserve a British tone in the young colony. Many were aristocratic and had private means. They still bought their commissions. They provided the social leadership in an unsophisticated society. Garrison towns looked to the military for other things too. In Kingston, the garrison spent £100,000 a year on food and drink, fuel and other supplies. The private soldier was usually illiterate. He was the sort of man that Wellington described as scum during the Peninsular War. He was kept under rigid discipline enforced by the lash. He was paid 1 shilling a day, out of which he had to buy his food. On the parade ground, the temperature in summer touched 115 degrees. They lived 19 to a room. They slept on straw palliasses on iron cots, and they were given 1 blanket for covering. In winter, this was the coldest sentry post in the British Empire. On overseas service, only 6 in every 100 soldiers were allowed to take their families with them, and the families too lived in these casemates. Boredom was their main enemy, drunkenness their chief diversion. Kingston alone boasted 2 distilleries, and they could always desert. The United States was just across the river. 2,000 deserted from Kingston in 50 years. Boredom was also the enemy of the officers. "I think Quebec the dullest town I ever was in," wrote one in 1838. "Sleighing is the only winter outdoor amusement, except skating." Driving out to the Montmorency Falls near Quebec was fashionable. They were the highest in North America, and in winter the spray formed a giant cone of ice at their base. The falls were also a favorite spot for summer picnics. Scenes such as this were painted by officers who'd learnt watercoloring as part of their training. They drew the Indians, who were no longer of any political importance. They had dwindled to being merely picturesque. The French Canadians, still aloof and self-contained, also attracted the military artists. Another way of ensuring that Canada remained British was to send out immigrants as well as soldiers. In Britain, an economic slump had followed the Napoleonic Wars, accompanied by a population explosion. There was no lack of potential emigrants, since the poor were urged on all sides to escape their misery by going overseas. Henry Russell, a leading songwriter, hymned the delights and rewards of emigration in his music. He was part of an industry that promoted emigration. He wrote hundreds of songs and did very well out of them. Songs which he performed in his popular one-man diorama shows, as here at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly.
To the land of the free, where mighty Missouri rolls down to the sea. When a man is a man, if he's willing to toil, and the humblest may gather the fruits of the soil. Where children are blessings, and he who has most has aid for his fortune and riches to boast. When the young may exult and the aged may rest, away, far away to the land of the West. To the west, there is wealth to be won. The forest to clear is the work to be done. We'll try it, we'll do it, and never despair, while there's light in the sunshine or breath in the air.
Henry Russell had a ready-made audience. In the Highlands of Scotland, the lairds were clearing the hills of their clansmen to make room for sheep. In Ireland, the potato crop failed 3 years running in the 1840s. The peasants starved. Rents went unpaid and tenants were evicted to join the stream of people fleeing from the famine-stricken countryside to the ports. Ireland lost 2 million people in these years. Many died of hunger and disease. The rest emigrated. The passage to Quebec was cheapest. Ships which had brought timber to Britain returned to Canada with the emigrants as ballast. Henry Russell had a song for this, too.
A life on the ocean wave, a home on the rolling deep, where the scattered waters rave and the winds their revels keep. Like an eagle caged I pine on this dull unchanging shore. Oh, give me the flashing brine, the spray and the tempest roar. A life on the ocean wave, a home on the rolling deep, where the scattered waters rave and the winds their revels keep. The winds.
But the voyage could be a hell, and for many it was death on the ocean wave. The Atlantic crossing could last 2 months. On most ships, the emigrants were crowded below deck with poor food and bad water. Weakened by hunger, disease could spread rapidly among them. and there was always the danger of sudden shipwreck. The survivors of the journey to Canada sailed up the splendor of the St. Lawrence River. They were disembarked at Gros-Île, an island which lies 30 miles from Quebec and was the quarantine station for the colony. It was described as a fairy scene, with exquisite glades, groves, wild flowers, and glimpses of the river. In 1847, it became a place of horror. The first ship of the season arrived on May the 17th. It was the first of many with cholera and typhus on board. By the end of that month, there were 40 ships waiting to unload in a line 2 miles long. There were 15,000 emigrants on board, and many were dying. The situation was already out of control. There were 1,100 cases in these fever sheds on the island. The sick and the well were rowed ashore and landed on this pleasant beach that became known as Cholera Bay. One man wrote, "Hundreds were literally flung on the beach, left amid the mud and stones to crawl to dry land as best they could." The chaplain on the island described them dying like stranded fish, with thousands prostrate in the open fields and beaches. Ministering to the sick, 19 priests and 23 doctors caught cholera. This monument is to 6 of the doctors who died. It overlooks the Irish cemetery and is marked on the back, "In this secluded spot lie the mortal remains of 5,294 persons who, flying from pestilence and famine in Ireland in the year 1847, found in America but a grave." Each cross is over the grave of 1,000 bodies. Over 100,000 people left for British North America in 1847. 17,000 of them died on the crossing, and a further 20,000 in Canada. An official wrote, "If crosses and tombs could be erected on the water, the whole route of the emigrant vessels would have assumed the appearance of a crowded cemetery." One young lady who went to Canada at this time was Susanna Moody. She was middle class and married to John Moody, a retired officer. Her family home had been Raiden Hall in Suffolk. They were in financial difficulties and thought Canada would solve them. Susanna wrote a book about her experiences.
"I went to take a last look at the old hall, the beloved home of my childhood and youth, to wander once more beneath the shade of its venerable oaks. Dear, dear England, why was I forced by a stern necessity to leave you?
On arrival in Canada, Susanna found this.
Not a house, but a cattle shed or pigsty. I could only stare at the place, my eyes swimming with tears.
She was lucky to have a roof. For most new arrivals, there waited an untouched wilderness, an appalling and hostile silence. Even Highlanders feared the Canadian forest. A Gaelic poem says, "Before I make a clearing and raise crops and tear the tyrannous forest up from its roots by the strength of my arms, I'll be worn out and almost spent before my children are grown up." To clear away trees became an essential, almost obsessive act. They were hateful things that stood between you and survival. The first task was to make a clearing. You had to build a shelter as quickly as possible. No one could survive exposed to a Canadian winter. You cut and notched the logs and piled them up to build the cabin. Neighbors might come to lend a hand. The chinks were filled with mud in a manner more primitive than that of medieval England. Susanna, nursing a baby, endured a winter when the temperature fell to 30 degrees below zero.
The rigour of the climate subdued my proud, independent English spirit, and I actually shamed my womanhood and cried with the cold.
The forest had one kindness to offer, the maple tree. Its sap starts to run in March. An Irish girl wrote home,
"But what flog doll that I'd ever seen was making sugar out of a tree, Mary? Not a word of a lie, do I tell you? You take a big gimlet and make a hole in the tree, and out comes the sugar, like sweet water, thick like, and you boil it, and you... But what's the good of telling you anything about it, as you've no sugar trees at home?"
Susanna Moody grew tired of making sugar, but welcomed the income it provided. Spring brought a return to the most exhausting sort of agriculture.
Boy. Here.
The stumps of the trees they had cut down were left in the ground to rot away. They ploughed around them with oxen, the only animals powerful enough to work in this bush.
King. Oh, ha! Come on. Come on. King, King. Come on. Over here. Ha! King, come on. Come on. Come on.
The intense heat, the mosquitoes, and the blood-sucking black fly made the work even more terrible.
Come on, King. Get up. Move. Come on, get up. Come on.
There was a cycle of clearing land and planting and then clearing more that seemed unending. Yet this labour, as much as the victories along the St. Lawrence, was the making of Canada. It was a lonely life, especially for the women. Their toughness was remarkable. Despite all the farm work, Susanna Moody brought up 4 children and nursed a sick husband as well. It took her a long time to come to terms with her new life, but in the end she could say,
I have contemplated a well-hoed ridge of potatoes with as much delight as in years long past I had experienced in examining a fine painting in some well-appointed drawing-room.
Many pioneers who stuck it out found a modest prosperity and independence, perhaps in a more comfortable cabin of squared logs. But some found they had bought useless land. With this in mind, Susanna Moody wrote,
O ye dealers in wild lands, ye speculators in the folly and credulity of your fellow men, what a mass of misery have ye not to answer for? What to you were the worn-out frames of the infatuated purchasers?
By the 1850s, British investment in Canada began to pay off handsomely. Timber crashed and surged down the rivers to supply Britain and the United States. The British saw a nation in the making and decided to help the process along. They united Upper and Lower Canada, the English and French provinces, under the same administration for the first time. A lumber camp called Bytown was chosen by Queen Victoria as the capital for this new province. She renamed it Ottawa. The new province was given a constitution and a generous measure of self-government. In 1860, the Queen sent her son, Edward, Prince of Wales, to lay the foundation stone of the Parliament in Ottawa. It matched Westminster for romantic fantasy, Britain's first export of parliamentary Gothic. It was to be by no means the last. Prince got a rousing welcome in loyal Canada. He found a rapidly developing country with a population of 3 million. Cities were springing up where before there had been only pioneer settlements. Travelling as Lord Renfrew, he then visited the United States. He was greeted as the Prince and rapturously feted. The London Times predicted eternal peace between the two nations. The very next year, the American Civil War broke out, North against South. It was a civil war with international repercussions. The northern states stopped a British ship, the Trent, and took off 2 southern diplomats. This was the stuff of which wars were made. Britain sent 12,000 troops to Canada. They crossed the Atlantic in 10 days in the new steamships, like the Great Eastern. They were rushed to reinforce the Canadian frontier. It was the most dangerous confrontation since the War of 1812. But President Lincoln said that he preferred to fight his wars one at a time, and tactful diplomacy by Britain made the war preparations unnecessary. The United States had 500,000 men under arms, the best army in the world. The balance of power had clearly swung against Britain in North America. To bring about a lasting peace, Britain decided to make Canada independent. It encouraged a conference between leaders of Canada's still separate provinces to discuss unification. The conference succeeded, and in 1867 Britain sanctioned the Kingdom of Canada. The name was changed to Dominion in deference to Republican sentiments in the United States. Sir John Macdonald was its first Prime Minister. There was one remaining problem which could threaten the new harmony with the United States, the settlement of the Canadian West. This was empty, except for tribes of wandering Indians who depended on the wild buffalo for food and clothing. But the buffalo was nearing extinction. Indians were being drawn into the Cypress Hills on the Canadian side of the frontier, where buffalo still survived in well-watered valleys. On the heels of the Indians came Americans. They set up trading posts on Canadian territory to peddle guns and whiskey. They massacred a party of Indians suspected of horse stealing here at Solomon's Post. To keep the peace in the Canadian West, a new force was raised, the Mounties. To begin with, there were only 300, but many had served in the British Army. They were originally to be called the Northwest Mounted Rifles, but at the last minute the Canadian Prime Minister changed their name to the Northwest Mounted Police.
From the right, form, set, quick, ta!
Even as police, they were equipped with 9-pounder guns. They wore redcoats, for the Indians hated and feared the American blue, but respected the red of an army that had done them no harm. In July 1874, the Mounties set out from Winnipeg on their long march to the west. It covered 2,000 miles, and they did not lose a single man.
Yes, quickly! Look up, look up, look up. Cameras are very much on you as they can. Arm the right! Long half sector! Up, hard!
Along their line of march, they set up forts. This one is in the Cypress Hills near the American border. It is called Fort Walsh after its first commander. When Sitting Bull and his Sioux warriors escaped into Canada after massacring Custer and his regiment, it was Walsh who rode into the Indian camp and told Sitting Bull he could stay, provided he kept the Queen's peace. The warlike chief obeyed the Redcoats. He stayed and kept the peace. Because of the Mounties, the settlement of the Canadian West by later waves of immigrants was to be relatively peaceful. Canada had also assumed responsibility for defending her frontier in the east. Canadian regiments took over the guard at Fort Henry and the other British bases. And so in 1871 the British were able to withdraw their legions. The watch on the frontier that had lasted 100 years came to an end. The patient British regiments went home, and even today what they achieved is not forgotten by their successors. They left behind them a nation free and secure, the first dominion in the British Empire.